Okay, so good morning, everyone. And first, Anna, Elise, and Anita, congratulations, and thank you for coming to Israel and to Tel Aviv. And but first, if you could introduce yourself, and then we can kick off.
Thank you very much. Very excited to be here. So I am Anna. I am a historian of psychiatry, and today I'm just going to talk very briefly about my different projects. And so I was thinking about dividing it into 3 parts, 5 minutes into 3 parts, and talk about sort of different engagements, or sort of different areas in which the history of different areas of history and of human experience, in which psychiatry and history of psychiatry is really helpful for us to understand historical developments. And so here in the first slide, I sort of wrote about reimagining the human mind in the 20th century, and this is the sort of the essence of my research, and sort of looking at how the human mind and the human psyche are imagined, redefined, defined, discussed, contested in different aspects, in different contexts in the course of the 20th century. And so people in the broader public, but also some fellow historians, sometimes say to me that psychiatry and history of psychiatry is a niche topic. And so I have always been arguing that psychiatry is absolutely central to understanding historical and political developments and the most important political issues of at least of the 20th century, but probably beyond as well. So why is psychiatry relevant to us beyond clinical concerns and discussions? And of course, in the first instance, I think understanding how the medical profession, but also how broader society, as I said, understands and imagines and redefines the mind, the psyche, but also the core traits of the mind, the pathologies of the mind, the healing of the mind, right? I think has a lot to say about how that society and how that medical profession thinks about human nature, in quotation marks, and human behavior. And that, I think, gives us a unique insight into how a society thinks about its core values, its norms, but also its taboos. What does a society, what does a community think needs to be pathologized, what is subversive, what needs to be put away, hidden, or cured, right? But on the other hand, I think psychiatrists themselves, especially in the course of the 20th century, have considered themselves, because they deal with the mind, they deal with the human behavior, and they've always considered themselves sort of uniquely equipped to, because of their supposedly unique insight into human behavior, uniquely equipped to actually engage with and to treat the sort of the ills of modern society, or the core ills of modern politics. And interestingly, in the 20th century, others, decision makers, politicians, other commentators have believed that psychiatrists are so uniquely equipped to proclaim on these important political and social topics. So in that sense, psychiatry became a really important site where some of the most important political and social issues of the day were debated and discussed and contested. So now 3 areas. The first one, very briefly, is psychiatry and war. And my first book dealt with a history of psychiatry in the course of the Second World War. And I think here we should talk about, I'll talk briefly about the source, my sources. We'll come back to that, but I was trying to write a history of the Second World War and the occupation and collaboration, but also resistance and revolution in Eastern Europe through these psychiatric patient case files, which I think give a unique insight into how sort of non-elite sections of the population, often illiterate and often politically illiterate, experienced the war and the extreme violence, but also the sort of extreme political ideological conflict that was going on in the 1940s Europe, and how these unprecedented dislocation, such as the violence, but also the revolution, right, transformed and affected everyday lives of so-called ordinary people. So psychiatric patient files consist of their clinical documents, and they consist of often fairly detailed interviews with patients, between patients and psychiatrists, and they also include patients' own writings quite often, and a patient's own art, right? And so it is really, it is a medley of voices and sort of power relations and power hierarchies, which I think gives us a unique insight into some of these important histories. A second one is psychiatry and international relations and international history. And in my second book, On the Line Psychiatry, I sort of tried to look at the Cold War Europe and try to rethink these boundaries and ideological divisions in the Cold War Europe through kind of reading medical and psychiatric networks that developed across the Iron Curtain and these cultural and political exchanges that developed across the Iron Curtain and transfers of knowledge. And I think here it's really sort of interesting to think about psychiatry as, again, a window, an important window into these divisions and into this sort of complex political dynamic of a divided Europe and how a divided Europe thought about not only the psyche, but also political re-education, also like reforming children and individuals and families. And I think, again, how these often abstract ideological wars or debates of the Cold War affected and changed individual lives and played out in families, for instance, or in clinical rooms. And finally, what I'm working on at the moment is psychiatry and decolonization. And again, psychiatry here becomes a very important site with some of the most important questions about human nature and human psyche and the relationship between individual psyche, race, and culture are being debated. So we look at the emergence of transcultural psychiatry as a site where the human mind and, again, the human nature, human psyche are reimagined in this new post-colonial world. And so the role of culture and cultural context is particularly important. And again, sort of utopian psychiatry. So I have this concept of utopian psychiatry when I think of mid-20th century and post-colonial global psychiatry. And again, sort of psychiatrists imagine themselves as really sort of uniquely placed to think about the future of mankind in the aftermath of the Second World War and the sort of the drama of decolonization and the war. And it's because of that they because of that insight into human mind and behavior, they sort of thought of themselves as sort of uniquely placed to prevent future wars and to teach people to live together in one world. And as one psychiatrist and head of the WHO in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War said, now it's up to psychiatrists to decide the future of human race. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll just say that this is of the future thing that we're planning now. We're setting up a research center for culture and the mind, where some of these core issues about the relationship between the historical context and political and cultural context and our ideas about the human mind are going to be discussed in a very interdisciplinary context. And we're trying to bring in psychiatrists into this debate and think about humanities and clinical research agendas together. And so this is partly where my prize will be spent. Thank you very much.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here. I thought I'd just describe in very broad terms, bird's eye view of what are my main research interests. And they focus really on two main sets of questions. So the first set of questions actually came out of my undergraduate degree when I actually got a degree in genetics as well as in Middle Eastern studies. And so in the course of that experience, I decided that I wanted to do a PhD in the history of human genetics. And I was very motivated by trying to understand how does genetic science relate to other ways of understanding human identity and ancestry. For example, ideas about race, ideas about national belonging. And how is it that during the 20th century, genetics in particular has come to so strongly influence political sensibilities of the definition of ethnicity or nationhood. And then the second set of questions that interests me is about how historians should actually write the history of sciences like genetics. So there are already quite a few histories of genetics, but many of them portray the main events of this history, all of the important science as being done in the laboratories of Europe and North America. But being influenced by my background in Middle Eastern studies, what I wanted to figure out is how different would this history look if we instead center the story of the history of this science, human genetics, in the Middle East. So it took me about 10 years to try to answer these questions, and this culminated in my first book, which is pictured there on the slide, Genetic Crossroads. So that was an attempt to trace the history of human genetics across the Middle East. So I wasn't focused only on one country, but looking very much at scientific networks that stretch from Iran to Turkey, to Israel, to Lebanon, to Egypt, and so on, and trying to understand the Middle East as the center of both regional and transcontinental networks in the history of human genetics. And so what I came to argue in this book is that the Middle East has, in fact, been an especially important site for human genetics ever since this science formed, really beginning in the 1920s. Because since that period of time, the Middle East has been described as a crossroads or a contact zone of what are supposed to be the three major continental races, African, Asian, and European. So this is the way that scientists perceived the importance of the Middle East. And then it was especially important not only because of being at the intersection of these so-called racial groups, but also because the region is full of hundreds of nomadic tribes, small religious sects, and so on. And many of these groups claim to have married only among themselves for centuries, since biblical times, even earlier. And geneticists around the world have actually sought out exactly these types of communities as ideal research subjects. And so it's because of these unique social and geographic circumstances that Middle Eastern scientists and Middle Eastern peoples as research subjects have made significant contributions to the study of human genetics. And so what I became particularly interested in the course of my research was the professional lives of the Middle Eastern researchers who shaped this production of genetic knowledge. So pictured on the slide is just a small number of the many individuals I studied. And I do believe it is important to highlight the contributions of Iranian, Turkish, Arab scientists who have often been overlooked in Eurocentric histories of science. But in acknowledging those contributions, we also have to acknowledge that the relationship between these scientists and their research subjects, the people that they collected blood from, the people that they studied, those relationships were highly unequal. And this inequality reflected the formation of states based on ethnic nationalism since the 1920s. So within these nation states, the people pictured on this slide who are doing the research, these scientists, they represent a class of elite technocrats. So they are politically and socially invested in consolidating specific kinds of national identities. And therefore, their collection of genetic data was always very closely entangled with certain kinds of political goals. So for example, some people in Iran, in Turkey, in the different Arab states, were deeply invested in trying to categorize their own nationalities as being racially white or European. In terms of domestic politics, they were often concerned about how to represent or sometimes suppress the representation of ethnic diversity within their state borders to justify certain nationalist discourses. And then, of course, within the context of Israel, it won't be at all surprising that any attempts to scientifically attest to the claims of particular communities and their relationship to ancient civilizations has always been very politically contentious. So that's what many of the scientists were participating in when they did genetic research. And at the same time, many of the research subjects of these genetic projects belonged to minority groups who often suffered from violent histories of discrimination or outright ethnic cleansing. So we need to acknowledge these problematic relationships. So the troubling aspects of these kinds of scientific relationships between scientists and their research subjects, but also between scientists from different regions, led me to scrutinize the historical idea of scientific collaboration. Like now we hear a lot about scientific collaboration. We assume that it's always a good thing, right? Something about the sharing of knowledge. But in fact, when I tried to analyze sort of the history of this concept and how it manifested at different times and places, you see something much more complicated and politically invested come about. So one case where I did this was I looked at the Pasteur Institute of Tehran during the 1950s in one article, and I scrutinized this very complex professional hierarchy between Iranian, French, and American researchers at this institute. So all of these groups of scientists often butted heads. They had their conflicts, and yet they were all united by a sort of ethically problematic treatment of rural Kurdish villagers, who are pictured here on this slide, who were treated as experimental subjects. So this is one example of how I analyze this problem. And now I'm just going to very briefly talk about two new projects that I'm just getting started on. One of which is really closely continuing to explore the scientific collaborations of Middle Eastern geneticists, but now in a new geographical direction. So whereas before I focused very much on collaborations of Middle Eastern scientists with European and North American geneticists, now I'm actually investigating in this new project called Race Across Asia, collaborations between Japan, India, Turkey, and Iran. So there I'm analyzing a flow of scientific ideas about shared racial identity across Asia. So for example, this map on the slide is from 1933, produced in Japan, and it's supposed to depict the so-called Turanian races, which linked the Japanese people linguistically and biologically to Turkic peoples as far away as Iran and Anatolia. So I'm investigating those kinds of scientific concepts and how they shaped the nature of scientific collaborations. And then finally, the last project, which I'm just getting started on, is actually about the origins of ancient DNA sequencing with a focus on Egypt as the center of this history. So this project starts in the 1930s with the work of two American geneticists depicted on that slide, William and Lyle Boyd, who were the first people to attempt the blood typing the tissue of Egyptian mummies in the 1930s. So they can be credited with originating a new field called paleoserology. This is the predecessor to modern ancient DNA sequencing technologies. But I'm interested in taking them as a starting point to begin investigating the Egyptian scientists and institutions that the Boyds worked with to better understand how Egypt's people, both ancient and living, have shaped the development of this now very prominent scientific field. So, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It is an honor to be here. And my name is Anita Radini, and I am assistant professor at UCD School of Archaeology at the University College in Dublin. And I thought I would tell you a little bit about my job so that I can explain you how the idea of looking into people's mouth, that is my research, has come about. So I am originally coming from a mixed background of natural sciences and archaeology, using archaeological science and human paleoecology. My interest originally was the complex interaction that exists between people and the cultural and natural environment. I think we see today very much our culture and the way we live is impacting on that environment that is very diversified through human history, and it started a very long time ago. In order to do that, I also became archaeological science and community officer in a number of experimental archaeology centers, including the one I'm working now at UCD. So for those of you who don't know, an experimental archaeology center is a place where archaeologists put themselves into the shoes of ancient people. What we do in these centers is replicating or try to replicate what people did and needed to know to produce every object, everything they needed to make a living. When we look at archaeology, though, the results of this experiment talk about buildings and objects, sometimes about the sensory experience, but very rarely they focus on the people who made those objects. The ancient craft people, those who work we admire in museums, in archaeological sites, every time we look around for archaeological evidence, they are pretty much invisible. So I wonder, when I was doing my experimental work, what can dust generated during the production of objects and buildings can tell us about the way the people live, and where do we look for it? So a while ago, I became interested in dust and dirt. So I am effectively an archaeologist of dirt. And one of the things that I observed during experimental work was that every single time I tried to produce pottery or textile work or building work, or I was simply observing other people doing, I needed water. I needed water to wash away my dry mouth. So one day I thought, why is that? Why is this happening? Why do I feel grit in my mouth? And the reality is that every single time you produce a craft or something, in one picture I'm making flour, the way it was done in the Viking period. In another way, I am trying to understand the knowledge you need to do metal work. So you can see from those two pictures that those environments would be very different. So effectively what happened is that there is an invisible environment around you that you are effectively ingesting and inhaling accidentally every day from the moment you're born to the moment effectively you die. Breathing is the one thing we need to survive. This makes our mouth potentially an archaeological site, because inside our mouth every day we also form the unpleasant dental plaque that it costs so much to be removed by our dentists. In ancient time, people didn't have the same oral hygiene we have today. So as dental plaque formed and remained on teeth, it became a stone, which means that it was absorbing and incorporating tiny microscopic particles down to nanoscales of the air and the dust that people were exposed to. And this is why I consider myself an archaeologist of the human mouth. I dig teeth, basically. And I spend a lot of time studying craft and this dust. So I thought that to facilitate the discussion, maybe I can give you an example of how things look. So my daily life, besides the fascinating work with craft people, where I sit down watching them doing their stuff and me playing a little bit with pottery and textile, my daily life is a lot of time spent at the microscope looking how tiny particles look like. So I prepare pigments and I use different type of microscopes. And the evidence that I have is not words. It's the way nature writes, which is effectively dust. And you can see on the right the fragments of textile from the Roman period. These are the flecks that are around these long bits, is dental tartar from Roman people, ancient Roman people from York. So my work it also consists in spending a lot of time into my own saliva and the saliva of people, which means that this isn't very popular during COVID time. So at the moment, I am kind of catching up with the 2 years in which I couldn't go around sampling people's mouths. And this, just to give you, so you don't just trust my word, this is a mouth swab and lip sample, my own, from the production of lazurite blue, a pigment that was used in medieval illumination. So there's a lot of dust going on in there. Because this work relies on so much laboratory work, I love my job because it's very collaborative. If I am at the microscope, I am not reading books very often. I read not as much as I would like. So I collaborate strongly with other people, with craft people, and with historians a lot, which is why I really like it. So I thought that rather than going on, you can ask me questions later on how this works like. I want to tell you also why I do this and why I love it. I love to do this because 50% of the world today still makes a living practicing traditional craft. We don't see that in our society, but half of our planet do. There are nearly no data on the quality of air and the quality of hygiene they are experiencing. So by working with modern people today, we can provide support in creating an healthier environment for this tradition. And the craft people, like I work a lot in North Africa, can help us to track their ancestors. Effectively, this is a collaboration between very different fields. And I love my job for two reasons. The first is that when you do this, you realize that nature has a way of writing its own history that is invisible and is this tiny trace of dust and air quality. So I feel privileged that under my microscope I can see this invisible world. But this invisible world, I can track it into the mouth and now potentially the intestinal continent of mummies and other people, ancient people, and track the craft people that are invisible. So there are two invisible things that I think the work that we do in this field are allowing us to do it. It also has given me a very good understanding of the knowledge, the importance of intangible heritage, the knowledge that is needed to turn a piece of wood into an object of utility or art. That knowledge is disappearing fast and we really need to protect it. And it put me to meet a lot of very many extraordinary people that can barely read and write and that are really nearly invisible. So I feel very privileged. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these self-presentations, which brings us to the first question. Elise, you explained how you came to be interested in history of genetics. It started from your very interesting and not very common combination during your undergraduate studies. But was it intentional? For my own work on history of medicine, in retrospect, I can explain how it was intentional, but reality, I have to be honest, and probably it was sort of a fluke. So how was it for you? Did you know that you want to be whatever you are now?
Can I start?
Please.
No, I didn't, and I have to make the confession that my first motivation was curiosity. I went into research to learn more about things that interested me in a natural way. And then I began to chase things that I found interesting, basically. And to me, when I started looking into ancient skeleton, I realized how much we could tell about their origin, their diet, but the daily life, the occupation that frames their position in the society was so invisible that then became my main line of research.
Okay. Thank you. So I became attracted to psychiatry, but as this sort of discipline or as a science that seems to be in permanent crisis, sort of permanently undergoing these sort of shifts of paradigm within its own clinical boundaries, and sort of permanently redefining and rethinking some of its core concepts, and also permanently putting out fires, right? And constantly deflecting criticism, some quite crippling criticism. I think that's what I call psychiatry, the sort of the Cinderella of the medical sciences, and I think that's for a historian and for sort of humanities critical analysis, that's particularly productive and fruitful, because those crises really can tell us so much about the broader social context and broader social and political crisis. But like Anita, I think I sort of see parallels there, even though the work is so different. But I grew attracted to psychiatric sources because there are these files and other clinical discussions, but also particularly many files about the patients, the journals, and the writings about the patients, precisely because they are incredibly rich and they're very understudied and often neglected, especially in the sort of Eastern Europe where I work. They give us really crucial information about those kinds of people that left no other historical trace in history. And I think that is really, it's the source that started it all, and then it went broader to science.
So to go back to your more targeted question, no, it wasn't intentional. So I can credit the University of California at Berkeley. That's where I did my undergraduate. And when I decided to major in everything, basically, right? So I did Middle Eastern Studies, I did biology. I also had a minor concentration in theater studies. So a credit to Mrs. David that I do have an interest in theater as well. So I initially considered all these interests to be separate, and why can't we have many interests? But the reason that I came to decide that this is what I wanted to do in my PhD was actually precisely because everyone I met, regardless of what field they were in, would always ask me, Middle East and biology, what do those two things have to do with one another? Like in their mind, they couldn't possibly overlap. Maybe they would think, oh, well, you must mean the ancient, or the Islamic golden age of the Middle East, and there's something to do with medicine there, wasn't there? And so it just got me to thinking, why is there this common assumption that in the modern Middle East there's no science there? There can't possibly be an overlap. So it was that sort of common perception which actually led me to think, no, there must be, there's a problem here, and I want to understand what happened to cause people to think in this way. And so that's what led me in the last year of my undergraduate to decide that this is what I would investigate.
But when it comes to methodology, the choice is very intentional. So can you take us into the process that you went through in deciding that you want to explore the sources in one way and not the other?
Yeah, so I am trained. I got my training as a sort of in general history, in sort of general European history, focusing on Eastern Europe, and in a similar way to Elise, I sort of kept getting these questions. Sort of, what does the Balkans have to do with psychiatry? It's a problem. There's not a link that people would necessarily make, and this is my first study, sort of the history of psychiatry in Yugoslavia, and so I think from that point of view, so I am trained as a historian and as a cultural and social historian, and then I went into I was really interested in sort of questions about the social and micro history of this region, and social and cultural history, and when I approached clinical files without really clinical training, and we'll come back to that, I guess. Without psychiatric clinical training, I treated them as conventional history sources, or as literary text as well. And so this is based on my training and sort of my own methodological or theoretical paradigm that I came to. So I have always read them as a historian and a little bit as a literary critic, and sort of trying to think about the voices and the meanings and the way meaning is constructed, and in the sort of interplay between psychiatrist and the patient, but also in dialogue with the broader social and political context. So I think it's that's mostly that.
So when I began my research, I started with the kinds of sources I was most familiar with for genetics, which were actually scientific publications. So peer-reviewed scientific publications in journals throughout the 20th century. And actually the style of writing those kinds of articles has changed quite a lot. So if you read the most recent ones, everything will be written in the passive voice. Such and such people were sampled. These tests were done. And so there's a way of concealing like how the work was actually done, how decisions were made at the scientific level. Fortunately, if you go deeper back into the past, there was a much more narrative style of writing in the 1920s, the 1930s, in which some of these scientists actually introduce their articles as though they're writing a travelogue. And so maybe you saw this as well in the sort of psychiatric publications, in which they explain the kinds of difficulties they faced, and also the kinds of, for example, biblical narratives, other kinds of, like really traditional narratives of ancestry that influenced the decisions that they made. So they're actually quite explicit about some of the politics of thinking about ancestry that shaped their studies. But you really can't get to the heart of why they did what they did until you're able to access letters that scientists wrote to each other. That's where they will admit, for example, that a lot of things didn't go as planned when they were doing these studies, where they expected that they would be able to convince people to cooperate, that the people would be interested in the research, when in fact they found that many of these people had no interest. They had their own sense of where they came from, their own origins, and they didn't see automatically the value of what the scientists wanted to do. In many cases, this is where you find the disturbing examples where scientists actually lied, or concealed the reasons why they were doing the studies that they were doing. And then they often complain to each other about the behavior, right, of the people that they're trying to study, and say, well, we started to offer them money, and even this wasn't enough. But then once you read their autobiographies, they'll be like, oh yes, these people were so cooperative, we had a great relationship with them, right? And so it's very important to read actually different kinds of sources. You need both the scientific publications, you need archival records of correspondence between scientists, which for Middle Eastern scientists is actually sometimes harder to get. So European and North American scientists had a much more elevated sense of the importance of what they were doing. It's their letters that often end up in the archives. So I spent a lot of time traveling around to archives and libraries in the Middle East, and I found much more fragmentary archival material than I did when I went back to Europe and North America. It was when they were corresponding with these famous Western scientists that you found the letters of Middle Eastern scientists preserved. So that was actually something initially disappointing for me in my research, that I spent so much time in the region and came up with less material than I did in the West. But it also helped me understand the importance of what I'm doing by trying to recenter, to think about what it means to write a history that's not located in the West, and what that means for methodology as well as argument.
So for me, was looking like with your publication when I was studying my PhD, which I did on dental tartar. And what I was realizing initially, the line of work on dental tartar focus on the evidence of starchy food. So a lot of archaeologists learn about how starch of different plants look like. And they began to publish stuff. Every time they published in the pictures that they were producing as evidence, there were a lot of other particles that had not been even mentioned in the paper because it wasn't the object of the paper. But coming from natural science, I've thought, okay, this is actually pollen, these are fibers, so there's something else going on here that isn't just food. And from my own work, I realized that the natural science background, I also have a specialism in paleontology and paleobiology, helped me a lot. And it is, I think it's fairly safe to say that archaeological science is a very competitive field. So I felt that also my PhD was self-funded. I felt that it was a way of doing something that really gave value to my work. And that was different, and it was worth doing it. So I exploited as much as I could my previous degree, so that was a huge advantage. So for me, it was opportunity, really.
And this brings us to a question that we talked about in our previous conversations, this background in science. As a history of medicine, I'm always asked whether I'm also a physician. I'm not. I don't have an MD. And many times this question is asked because there is expectations that whoever deals with medicine has medical background. I don't think it's a must. I don't think that I need to be dead in order to talk about death. But obviously it can be very helpful, and you gave some examples. So what is your position? There are many students here. Do you encourage them to include some background in sciences if they want to do history of science?
Well, I'm going to go for it because I work with historians a lot. So I don't think it is necessary in the same way that it is not necessary for me to be an historian, because I think at the moment the beauty of the moment we are in academia is the barrier between disciplines are falling really. So it is, I think collaborative ways are the key for the future. And I experienced that in my work on the lapislazuli dust on teeth, which is probably my most popular piece of work. I don't think I will ever have anything that good in my career again, probably. But I know about particles, but he was talking to the historian, Professor Elise Beach, who has spent her life understanding the chain operatoire of women working on books. That helped me to look for the experimental work I needed to interpret that material. I will never be able to spend 20 years doing that. I think it is, however, very good to be able to understand when the person you're working with is talking rubbish to you. So I do recommend a little bit of background. What we did and what we're doing we still work together, is Alison is coming in the laboratory with me, and she is being guided through the process. She had a 2-day training in archaeology, and she explained to us very clearly how she handles historical resources. That's probably is a 3 to 5 days exchange of knowledge, which I think is very feasible and highly recommendable, I think.
Yes, I think I agree that it's not necessary. I mean, I know many other historians of genetics who have written very good histories of the subject without having a background. On the other hand, I feel like it was a great advantage for me, especially in times when I had to do oral histories or interviews with scientists who are still alive. Many of them have a certain way of presenting their research to journalists, for example. They assume that you don't know anything, and they can just sort of tell you what they did, and that you will just accept at face value. And so then when I would be able to ask, well, why did you do the sampling in this way? Like, why did you make this decision? Or how did you, or why did you choose this interpretation? Then initially they are, of course, very surprised. This is not the kind of questions they were expecting, but it then moves my conversations with them to another level, because once they understand that you have a critical appreciation for what they do, they engage with you in a different way. And then they then become interested in understanding from you the history of the science that they're doing. So I think having this kind of interdisciplinary background is therefore useful for these conversations, just as you were saying. I think it also is helpful just in terms of the speed in which you're able to get into the research and to understand how quickly things change in the history of science. Like, it can be helpful to have that background, especially in a science like genetics. So the last time I was in a genetics laboratory actually sequencing DNA was 2010. Since then, it's now become a totally different science, and I'm no longer up to date with it at all, but I have an appreciation for what the scientists are doing now, and I can describe the technologies that I'm familiar with, and so I think that has been helpful for doing my work.
Thank you. Yes, I'm glad we agree that it's not essential to have clinical, because I've already revealed. But I think there is, as we talked before, in the history of medicine and in the history of psychiatry, and I'm not sure if that might extend to your field as well. The start, at the beginning of the field, right, when the field was being started by professionals, it was being written. It was written by medical doctors and by psychiatrists, and this kind of sort of Whiggish histories of medicine as a history of progress, a history of psychiatry psychiatry is a history of like, progress in conquering the truth, and so that was also that was done by people who had the medical and psychiatric background, had this sort of essential vested interest in the historiography of the field as a progressive science, right? And I think we are like several generations afterwards, and I think there is a bit of distance and a lot of criticism of the histories of medicine and psychiatry written by medical doctors and psychiatrists, and so I think it's quite common in my field to be a historian and not have a clinical training and be proud of not having any clinical training. But I think it is really quite difficult, and I think we all have, because I also read clinical publications and scientific, and so there is, and as well as the actual internal hospital files, and I think it requires a lot of informal education, a lot of informal training, a lot of informal, to be able to understand the clinical vocabulary, but also the broader paradigms within which these people were working. And I think it would have helped in interviewing psychiatrists and medical doctors to boost my own credibility. But I think now I'm trying to do this project which actually directly engages psychiatrists and clinicians with humanities researchers. And in order to deflect attention from my own lack of clinical training, I also think that it is very important that clinical practitioners, psychiatrists, medical doctors, but also scientists have some essential training or some core understanding of humanities and histories of their own discipline, but also our methodologies, our forms of critical analysis, also narrative medicine and narrative strategies that they also use. And so I think I would argue for some sort of a more engaged dialogue, cross-disciplinary dialogue, in that sense, that it's not only that historians need some degree of clinical training and clinical understanding, but that clinicians actually can really benefit from humanities in their own clinical work and also in their own scientific work. And it's really quite essential to have that degree of self-reflection or self-reflexivity and also understanding of your own discipline's history. And that's also very difficult.
Let's talk a bit about this dialogue between historians or archaeologists and scientists. And certainly we are privileged to live in a generation where disciplines still matter, but there is an ongoing willingness to also look above disciplines. But this dialogue sometimes it's not easy. And there is a basic barrier because science has this claim for universal truth, and what we do is actually going against exactly this grain. We look for the differences, the nuances, the changes. So how is it for you to engage the scientists in such a dialogue? Where do you see these perhaps different points of views, these possible contentions? When you tell them something about their own field of expertise, and which they may not be very happy to hear.
I feel like when Anita was talking about these disciplinary boundaries falling down, I think yes, they are in pain, in great pain and distress. They are falling down, and I think in the center that we're putting together, we're working very closely with two actually psychiatric clinics in Denmark, and there's such a great variety of reactions to historical to critical historical analysis and that sort of fundamental questioning of the truth. And I think there is something about historical contextualization in itself that that seems to undermine this kind of scientific practice in the view of some of these clinicians. And I think it is actually really difficult because I've talked to actually one of the most open-minded conversations and one of the most productive conversations that I had with a Canadian psychiatrist was when he was very open about the kind of the sort of the feeling of being stuck and sort of being sort of paralyzed by fear after he read a history of colonial psychiatry, a sort of history of racism in colonial psychiatry, and he was working in his clinic in Montreal, I think, and he had just been reading because he was really committed to doing this kind of historical research and historical self-reflection in his own profession, and read about this sort of history very because psychiatry was one of the core pillars of the colonial system, and there's no way around that. There's no way of escaping that. And then he said, then he went to the emergency room, and then when he had to deal with patients as a white male psychiatrist, he said it was really quite crippling, and it was really kind of he constantly reflecting, constantly questioning himself, and it made it much more difficult for him to do his job. So I do understand that, and that is not our purpose, I think, to cripple and paralyze. But I think it is really quite difficult, and I do understand how these, especially the way maybe medical education and psychiatric education has been developing in the last few decades. It's a sort of increasingly separated from any humanities education, from any kind of humanities, even methodological sort of critical practice, and or even social scientific education. So they've been moving in a radically different direction, where there was no space, I think, no genuine space for either historical reflection or that kind of critical self-reflection, engagement with narratives, with discourses, thinking about power dynamics and power relations, and one's own positionality within those power relations. And so I think it's extremely difficult, and it has these sort of practical, very, very, very difficult practical clinical consequences, this engagement, but it can be really it can be extremely useful. So what we're doing is really difficult, and our conversation with psychiatrists have their ups and downs, but I think it is, especially in the current moment when we are dealing with this sort of mass movement of population, mass migration, we're dealing with such fast political changes and cultural and cross-cultural changes. I think it's extremely I think valuable for clinicians to think critically and self-critically about their own position, but also to think about their patients and the people and the audience that they're engaging in terms not only in sort of narrow clinical terms, but to sort of think of broader social and political context, and again power relations that determine not only their own profession globally, but these micro encounters in the clinic.
Yeah, so the question in terms of engaging with scientists, I think what's been important, that this actually relates a bit to the earlier question where you talk about your own relationship to the science, what your training is, and so on. I found that geneticists, as an example, and I think this is true of many scientific communities, if you advance a sort of critique based on history or current social implications, and they perceive you as an outsider to their community, they sometimes become very defensive. And they want to represent what they are doing, as you said, as sort of, well, we are accessing here the universal truth. If there's political implications, that's something separate. That's not what we are trying to do. And so you actually, what you need to do to kind of break down what might be a defensive reaction on the part of some geneticists is actually to look within the scientific community, and you'll often find that the same critiques are being advanced actually within the scientific community. So it doesn't have to be this kind of disciplinary clash, okay? And this is especially true when you're talking about the implications of the relationship between genetics and racialized categories, right? So already there are geneticists of color, geneticists from the global south, which are concerned about actually the same problems that I'm writing about from a historical perspective. And it's important to actually reach out to those people as your partners in the conversation. And so instead of trying to, or I'm not trying to do this, but rather than let yourself be cast as someone who is against science, or like, obviously I'm not saying that these scientists as individuals are evil people. They're very complex people. Sometimes they made, poor ethical decisions that we would not consider acceptable today. They use their ideas to support ideologies that, are reprehensible in various ways. But we don't want to perceive science as this monolithic force, right? These are people, right, that are creating a discipline, and that discipline is shifting all the time. And not only today, but historically, there are debates among the scientists. So something I try to highlight very much in my research is to show the strong, differences of opinion between different scientists who are working at the same time, and to really highlight their disagreements. I think it's very important to show this, that the history of science is not this teleological advance toward a particular answer, a particular perspective, but it's being at every moment historically contested. And it's not predictable, actually, what would emerge as sort of the triumphant viewpoint within science. So that's the way I try to approach this problem, and how this is the sort of mindset from which I try to speak to scientists and make connections with them.
From my point of view, initially it wasn't very easy. And actually, I have to confess that for the lapislazzuli work, it took 4 years to find an historian willing to work. I contacted a number of people several times, and Ellison was the only historian who replied. So on something that we consider quite good. So it was really difficult. But because she was so open to the science, I have a very positive view of what can be obtained when that barrier kind of falls. And what it was interesting to see is that as an archaeologist that work in the Roman and medieval period, where there are a lot of historical resources and that archaeologists don't have in the prehistoric time, for example, I feared the judgment of historians, because often when I was doing my PhD, when I tried to reach out to some historians, they told me, we already knew that. Why are you doing this? And I'm like, okay, sorry. And to some extent, I understand that when I said to the historian, there is wheat and barley medieval teeth, they looked at me like, yeah, well, we have way better data than this on the production of wheat in the Middle Ages. So it was really hard. But talking to Alison, she told me that she equally feared the science for the same reason, because she felt the judgment of her work. So sometimes I think we have biases that are probably inbuilt in our discipline from the people, from that very initial stage in which discipline formed with their boundary. And I come from a country where, Italy, where if you have a degree in science, you cannot have a position in archaeology in the majority. So I will never be able to do archaeological sciences in many universities in Italy. In England, I worked for 4 years in a department of physics, barely know how to turn on machines. So my view is positive, but it is not easy. But we cannot let the difficult stop us, because out there are people willing to collaborate. But I think the biases that we have in our head and the fear of being judged, because we are under so much judgment at publication level. And at this point, I also say that for me, one of the difficult bits with historians has been the publication format of archaeological science. Archaeological science, sometimes you have 30 people on a paper. When you ask an historian who has published as single author for 30 years, the idea of being part of a team of 30 doesn't go well. So sometimes it's maybe finding in the publishing world a way of acknowledging the contribution of everybody equally would be a step forward. Because unfortunately, there is always a first author and a senior author, and I have a lot of paper in which I'm right in the middle, and I did the only work of that kind in that period. So sometimes it's also giving up maybe a bit of ego and not be wanting to be the first all the time would help there. Anyway.
One last question before we open the possibility for the audience to join us, so be prepared. There is one thing that I want to add. We circled around it, we haven't mentioned it, gender. Talking with people on the other side of the discipline, especially in sciences, many times it's a he rather than a she, at least certainly in previous generation, but still today, as as female scholars, how do you deal with that? Is it an issue? No?
Yes, this is an important question. Something that's particular, it's a bit unfortunate actually, because the pictures of the slide, only one of the only one of the scientists I happened to show was a woman, but if you read my entire long book, you'll actually discover that a large number of the scientists in this field in the Middle East, and it doesn't matter which country you look at, in Iran, in Turkey, as well as in Israel and the Arab countries, that there were many women involved as genetic scientists. However, very few of them show up in photographs. Okay, so this is an interesting thing. So I'm able to read their publications. In fact, one of the reviewers of my book, when it first came out, said this is actually remarkable because when you look at histories of geneticists in North America, in Europe, you're actually trying to search hard for like women scientists and what is their role in this research. And in my case, I didn't come in specifically looking to analyze this gender angle. It was right there in the sources. I didn't have to find it, that women were very active in this science. Yet, in many cases, I was limited in terms of the biographical material I could find about these women. So even though it was clear they were the prominent authors of publications, they were very active, only a few of them wrote, for example, biographies of themselves. Many of them were writing letters to scientists.
Talking about ego,
yes.
right?
Yeah. And however, so what I was able to say about their lives was very different from what I was able to say about the lives of the male scientists, right? Who were very happy to write all their biographies and save all their papers, and so on. They had a sense of their role in history, right? However, but yes, so gender sort of presented itself in my work. It's not a key part of my analysis. It's something that I think we need to analyze more closely. But it was definitely something that came as a big surprise, especially for people who aren't from Middle Eastern studies, that, oh, these Middle Eastern women, you know, you assume that, oh, they're not active in the sciences, for example, but they were. So this is something that I would like to explore more in my work, actually. In terms of the people I was able to interview, usually I was only able to find male scientists who talked to me. So this is also an interesting thing to consider.
Thank you. I think it's a difficult question, but same as in Elise's, not same, but similar in Elise's case, I was surprised when I started. So when you think about this this moment in psychiatry that I'm looking at, sort of mid-20th century and afterwards that I'm working on now, it is quite amazing about sort of global psychiatric exchanges between different parts of the world and experts coming together in leading global institutions. It is incredibly male when it comes to psychiatrists, the proper scientists of psychiatry, and then you have a lot of women working in soft professions like social workers and psychologists and translators and interpreters and people sort of trying to set up the atmosphere, and secretaries, of course. But actually, my dissertation and early research was in Yugoslavia and sort of mid-20th century psychiatrists in Yugoslavia and the immediate post-Second World War, the sort of revolutionary socialists, and then 50s and 60s. And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, a lot of psychiatrists I was working on and then interviewing later on were women, and they really set the tone of the discipline, and perhaps because I was working with child psychiatry and psychoanalysis in particular, I was some of the most important positions and functions in the psychiatric discipline went to women, and I talked to them. I talked to them a lot, and I think most of the people I interviewed were actually in the Yugoslav contexts were women. So that's also really quite striking. But I wonder, that had to do, of course, with the kind of deliberate policies of newly socialist Yugoslavia, but also had to do with the fact that I think psychiatry at the time in Yugoslavia was going very much in the direction of humanities and social sciences, and I think it's really quite interesting how these disciplinary divisions persist even in this field of psychiatry, which is particularly interesting because it brings together both clinical and social.
Thank you for the question. It's a very difficult one to be completely honest, because I don't want to get into trouble with people I work with. But, well, for me, I think everybody can see I am a middle-aged woman. I arrived quite late in the academic career. I am partially deaf, not a native speaker, and a woman doing some art sciences. So I cannot say that it was easy. But I have to say that now a lot of archaeological scientists are women. So things are changes, and I feel privileged that I am old enough to have seen the changes that are happening. And because there are more and more women voices, we give voice to other women. So I want to say this, we are also very competitive with each other. So one of the obstacles that we now have is how competitive we are one another. So it would be good to be a little bit more helpful, I think. For what concerns my research, I think this is what I also like of my research, because working with skeletons, that gender barrier sometimes fails, because you have female and male, especially in the Roman and medieval period, you can tell sexes really easily from the bones if they're sufficiently preserved. When you move in the prehistoric period, it's harder because the bones are not very preserved. And the occupational dust can tell you if a woman was an artist or not. And I think the popularity of some of the works comes on giving visibility. Some of the work I do, for example, in North Africa with remote community in the mountains, is showing that women have these skills today, and we need to help them to preserve them. So I think that on that I also have a very positive view. Compared to 20 years ago when I started studying, I think the situation is much better. But there is a lot of work to do. And we need to be collaborative with each other, because there is a lot of unfortunately, you compete for very few positions, and I think there's that problem too, unfortunately. But it's so much better than a long time ago. So.
And on this somewhat optimistic note, I think we can wrap up this panel by saying that we have yet another evidence that the marriage of science, exact science, and humanities, for example, history, archaeology, and so on, social sciences, this kind of marriage is not just beneficial, it's actually very, very important and politically charged, and that means that we should move forward exactly in that direction. So thank you very much, and let's have the continuity of the day.